She stole my watch! Check her bag! Check her bag! She's been stealing from customers for weeks!
That's a lie! You grabbed my wrist first. I never touched your watch.
Ma'am, hands behind your back.
Uni, please, please, don't let them take you.
That's her. That's my wife.
The glass shattered first, then the screaming started. Annie's hand was still raised when two security guards grabbed her arms and yanked her back from the table. The businessman clutched his cheek, red already blooming under his fingers, and pointed at her like she was a criminal instead of a woman who'd just told him no for the third time that night. "She stole my watch," he shouted, loud enough that every head in the restaurant turned. "Check her bag. She's been stealing from customers for weeks." It was a lie. Everyone near that table knew it was a lie. Nobody said a word. Annie's voice cracked as she tried to explain that he'd grabbed her wrist first, that she'd only slapped him because his hand wouldn't let go, that she had never touched his watch in her life. Nobody was listening. Phones were already up, recording. A news crew that had been filming a segment 2 tables over swung their camera toward the commotion, like sharks smelling blood. By the time the police walked through the door, Annie wasn't fighting anymore. She just stood there, wrists zip-tied, mascara running, while a 5-year-old girl clung to her leg and sobbed her name over and over. "Honey, please, please, don't let them take you." Across the city, in a penthouse office, 30 floors above the traffic, a man in a black suit sat frozen in front of a television screen, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating in his hand. He hadn't blinked in almost a minute. The reporter was saying something about theft, about assault, about a waitress being taken into custody outside a restaurant in Gangnam. None of that mattered to him. What mattered was her face, tear-streaked, terrified, achingly familiar, filling the screen in high definition for the entire country to see. Kane set the glass down so hard it cracked. "That's her," he said quietly, to no one, to the empty room. "That's my wife. If you're watching this, drop the city or country you're tuning in from. I want to see how far this story is traveling tonight." Before we go further, if this hook already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button now, because it only gets crazier from here. 3 years. 3 years since he'd thrown her out of his life, with nothing but a signed divorce decree and a set of accusations he never let her answer. 3 years of telling himself he'd made the right choice. 3 years of a silence that suddenly, violently, didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like a wound that had never actually closed. Kane was already reaching for his phone before he'd fully processed what he was doing. His fingers moved on instinct, dialing a number he shouldn't have still remembered, barking an order into the receiver before the call even connected. "Get my car now, and find out which precinct they're taking her to. I don't care what it costs. I want her out within the hour." His assistant, on the other end, hesitated. "Sir, with respect, that case involves your ex-wife. If the press connects your name to hers again, after everything that happened during the divorce." I said now. He was already moving, shrugging his suit jacket back on, jaw tight enough to ache. Behind him, the television was still playing the clip on loop. Annie's face, the little girl's scream, the flash of cameras, and something in Kane's chest twisted so violently he had to stop for half a second and press a hand against the wall just to breathe. He told himself it was outrage. Righteous anger at watching an innocent woman get railroaded on live television. He didn't let himself think about the other reason his hands were shaking. The truth was, some part of him had never stopped watching for her. Not obsessively. He wasn't a man who chased ghosts, but in small, involuntary ways. A woman with the same walk on a crowded street. A laugh in a coffee shop that made his head snap up before he could stop it. He'd buried it under 3 years of work, of silence, of telling himself that what happened between them was settled and done. One video clip had undone all of it in 90 seconds. By the time his car pulled up outside the police station, rain had started to fall, fine and gray under the streetlights. Kane stepped out without an umbrella, without his usual entourage of bodyguards trailing 2 steps behind. Just him, alone, walking through the doors like a man with something to prove. If you're enjoying this so far, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens when he sees her again is going to break you. The desk officer recognized him immediately. Everyone in this city recognized him immediately. There was a flurry of nervous bowing, a scramble of phone calls, and within 20 minutes, a speed that would have taken anyone else in Seoul 3 days to achieve, the paperwork was signed, the bail was posted, and the holding room door was unlocked. Annie was sitting on a metal bench with her wrists finally free, staring at the floor, when the door opened and she looked up to see the last man on earth she ever expected to walk through it. Her whole body went rigid. "No," she said immediately, standing so fast the bench scraped against the concrete. "No, absolutely not. Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, I don't want your help." "Annie, don't." Her voice cracked down the middle, half fury, half something rawer underneath it. "You don't get to disappear for 3 years and then show up now like you're rescuing me. You've already destroyed enough. Just go back to whatever life you built without me, and let me handle this myself." Kane felt each word land like a blow he couldn't block. He deserved every one of them, and he knew it, and it still didn't stop the ache spreading through his ribs. "You're free," he said instead, keeping his voice even, controlled, the way he controlled every room he ever walked into, except this one. "Bail's posted. You can go home." "I don't have a home," she snapped. "Not one you're welcome in." That was when the door at the end of the hallway burst open, and the little girl who'd been sobbing on television came running in, small arms flying around Annie's legs, face buried in her coat. "Honey, I was so scared. I thought they weren't going to let you come back." Annie dropped to her knees instantly, pulling the child into her chest, murmuring something soft and reassuring in a voice Kane hadn't heard, directed at him in years. And that was when it hit him, a thought so sudden, so seismic, that the floor seemed to tilt slightly under his feet. A daughter, 3 years apart. Is she mine? He didn't ask. He couldn't make his mouth form the words yet, standing there in a police station hallway, with rain still dripping off his shoulders, and his entire understanding of the last 3 years cracking open like a fault line. But here's where it gets crazy, because the truth about that little girl is about to turn this entire story upside down, and nobody in that hallway is ready for what comes next. Annie stood, scooping the girl onto her hip, and finally looked Kane dead in the eye for the first time since the divorce. "You want to know something?" she said quietly. "That businessman back at the restaurant, the one who had me arrested, he's not even the worst person to hurt me this year. Not even close." Kane's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" She just shook her head, exhaustion and old grief flickering across her face. "You lost the right to ask me questions 3 years ago. Go home, Kane." She turned and walked toward the exit, the little girl's small hand curled tight around a fistful of her coat, and left him standing there in the fluorescent light of a police station hallway, a man who had just bought his ex-wife's freedom and gotten absolutely nothing for it, except more questions than he'd walked in with. He watched the doors swing shut behind her, and for the first time in 3 years, Kane didn't move on. He followed. If you want to see what happens when he finally learns the truth about that little girl, and about who really destroyed his marriage, comment part 2 isn't needed yet. We've got a long way to go tonight. Stay with me. Rain was coming down harder by the time Kane caught up to her outside the station, his shoes splashing through puddles he didn't even register. Annie was trying to flag a taxi one-handed, the little girl balanced on her hip and failing, because it was almost midnight and every cab in Gangnam was already full. "Let me drive you," Kane said. "I'd rather walk. It's pouring." "I've survived worse than rain, Kane." She finally got a cab to slow, and as she reached for the door handle, the little girl twisted around in her arms and looked straight at him with wide, curious eyes. Eyes that were dark brown, not the near-black Kane shared with every blood relative he had. Something in his chest loosened, just slightly, at the sight of that detail, and then tightened again, because if the girl wasn't his, that raised an entirely different question. Whose child is she? The words came out before he could stop them. Annie froze with her hand on the door. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, then, quietly, without turning around. "Her name is Sori. Her mother was my best friend here in Seoul, Hana. We met the year after you and I divorced." Her voice thinned. Hannah died giving birth to her. No family left to take her in. I promised her before she passed that I would raise Sori like my own. The rain kept falling. Kane stood there absorbing it. The relief and grief and guilt, all tangled together in a knot he didn't know how to untie. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in months. "I didn't know you'd lost someone that close to you. You don't know a lot of things about the last 3 years." Annie finally turned to look at him, and the anger in her eyes had shifted into something wearier, older. "I built a whole life without you, Kane, a hard one. And I'm not interested in you walking back into it because you saw my arrest on the news and felt guilty. That's not why, isn't it?" He didn't have an answer for that, because some part of it was true, and they both knew it. Drop a comment if you think Kane actually deserves a second chance after everything, because trust me, once you hear what really happened 3 years ago, you might change your mind. If you're enjoying the story, hit that subscribe button. We've got a long way to go. Annie got into the cab. Sori waved a small hand out the window as it pulled away, and Kane stood alone on the wet sidewalk, watching the taillights disappear into traffic, feeling like he'd just been handed back a piece of his life he didn't know how to hold. He didn't go home that night. He went to his office instead, sat in the dark, and let his mind drag him back 3 years, to the last month he and Annie had actually been happy. 3 years earlier, Soul had looked different to him, softer somehow, filtered through the particular kind of happiness that made a person notice things, like the color of the sky, or the sound of rain on a restaurant awning. He and Annie had been married 2 years by then. She'd moved from Atlanta to be with him, learned enough Korean to argue with cab drivers, built a small, stubborn life for herself in a city that hadn't made it easy for her. They'd been good together, genuinely, unglamorously good, the kind of good that showed up in small moments, not grand gestures. Annie teasing him for being unable to cook anything beyond instant ramen, Kane learning to braid her hair badly because she asked him to try. Quiet Sunday mornings, where the empire he ran 6 days a week didn't exist at all. Annie had never planned on falling for a man like Kane. She'd come to Seoul chasing a teaching contract and a fresh start, not a relationship with someone whose name made restaurant hosts visibly nervous. Their first real conversation happened at a language exchange cafe, of all places. Kane, sitting stiffly in the corner with a textbook he clearly wasn't using, ordering the same black coffee 3 weeks running before he finally worked up the nerve to sit at her table instead of 2 down from it. "You've been staring at me for 3 Tuesdays, Annie had said, not looking up from her notebook. "Either sit down or stop wasting your coffee money." He'd sat down. He hadn't left, not really, for the next 2 years. What she loved about him wasn't the penthouse, or the drivers, or the way rooms rearranged themselves around his presence. It was smaller than that. The fact that he still remembered, months later, that she took her coffee with too much cream, and always ordered it anyway, just to watch her make a face at the first sip. The way he'd started leaving sticky notes in atrocious Korean on her mirror, phrases he'd clearly practiced, because he wanted her to feel like Seoul belonged to her too, not just to him. He wasn't an easy man to love. He carried the weight of an empire in his shoulders, even at dinner, even in bed, even on Sundays when he tried hardest to set it down. But he tried. That was the thing Annie held on to. He tried, for her, in ways she suspected he tried for no one else. Which was exactly why his silence, when Marcus resurfaced, had gutted her so completely. She hadn't recognized the man who stopped meeting her eyes at breakfast, who started coming home later, who looked at her one Tuesday evening like she was a stranger, wearing his wife's face. Then Marcus came back. Annie's college boyfriend, a man she hadn't spoken to in nearly 4 years, resurfaced out of nowhere. A work trip to Seoul, he claimed. A coincidence, he claimed. He started showing up. A coffee here, a catching up lunch there. Annie, trying to be polite to an old friend, hadn't thought much of it. Kane's second in command, a man named Junho, who had been at his side for a decade, had thought differently. Here's where it gets crazy, because the person who destroyed Kane and Annie's marriage wasn't Marcus at all. Stay with me, because this twist is the one that's going to make you furious. Junho had wanted Kane distracted, wanted him vulnerable, isolated, easier to manipulate into decisions that served Junho's own rising ambitions inside the organization. A married Kane, tethered to a woman he loved, was a Kane who thought too carefully, who couldn't be pushed into the kind of ruthless, fast decisions Junho needed to consolidate power around him. So Junho built a case, doctored photos of Annie and Marcus at a hotel, spliced from separate, innocent images taken weeks apart. Text messages fabricated on a burner phone, registered in Marcus's name, sent to a number that forwarded straight to Kane's private line, a witness, a hired actor, who swore under careful coaching that he'd seen Annie leaving Marcus's hotel room at 2 in the morning. None of it was true. All of it was convincing. Kane, blindsided and already primed by a childhood that taught him love was something people used against you, hadn't asked Annie for her side. He'd confronted her once, coldly, in the kitchen of the home they shared, and when she'd cried and denied it and begged him to believe her, he'd told himself tears were just another kind of manipulation. He filed for divorce 3 days later, had her belongings packed and shipped to a hotel before she even knew the papers existed. Annie, gutted and humiliated, and too proud to beg a man who'd already made up his mind, had signed without contest and walked away without a single word in her own defense. If you've ever had someone believe a lie about you over the truth, comment, "I know that pain," below, because this next part is about to hit different. Sitting alone in his office 3 years later, Kane finally let himself ask the question he'd spent 3 years avoiding. What if he'd been wrong? What if the woman he divorced over grainy photos and anonymous texts had never done anything at all? He pulled up his phone and stared at Junho's contact information for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 3 years, he opened the old case file he'd never let himself look at again, the evidence his legal team had compiled before the divorce, and started reading it with new eyes. By the second page, his hands had gone cold. The metadata on the photos didn't match, the timestamps were wrong, and the witness statement had been signed by a man whose name, cross-referenced against payroll records, buried 3 folders deep, turned out to be on Junho's personal payment ledger. Kane sat back slowly, the office silent, except for the rain still hammering the windows, and felt something in his chest turn to ice. He'd destroyed his own marriage over a lie his most trusted man had built brick by brick. And the worst part? Junho was still standing right beside him, every single day, acting like nothing had ever happened. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number lit up the screen, and when he opened it, his blood went cold a second time that night. Stay away from Annie, or the next headline won't be about a stolen watch. It'll be about a dead waitress. Kane read the message 3 times before the words fully registered. His first instinct was pure, cold fury, the kind that made grown men in his organization go quiet and leave rooms without being told to. His second instinct was terror, sharp and unfamiliar, because in 10 years of running an empire built on threats and leverage, no one had ever dared threaten a woman he loved, not because they respected her, because they knew what he'd do to them. He was already dialing his head of security before he finished standing up. Trace this number. I want a name in the next 30 minutes, and I want 2 men outside Annie's apartment within 10. Sir, we don't have her current address. Then find it. Now, if you think you know where this story is going, comment your prediction below. I promise you, you're wrong. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe, because the next 10 minutes of this story are about to get vicious. Across the city, in a penthouse suite considerably less impressive than Kane's, but decorated to look otherwise, the businessman from the restaurant, a man named Derek Choi Sung, mid-40s, old money, older grudges, poured himself a drink and smiled at his own reflection in the window. He'd expected Annie to sit in a holding cell overnight, expected her humiliation to spread across social media, expected her to lose whatever waitressing job she'd been clinging to, expected the entire encounter to end with her exactly where he wanted her, desperate, isolated, and dependent on him to make the charges disappear. Instead, some Mafia-adjacent businessman had waltzed into the police station and had her out within the hour. Derek's jaw tightened around his glass. He didn't like being outmaneuvered. He liked it even less when he realized exactly who had done the outmaneuvering, a man whose name alone made half the boardrooms in Seoul go quiet. Fine, he said softly, to no one, swirling the ice in his drink. If I can't have her the easy way, I'll just have to remind everyone why the easy way exists. He picked up his phone and began making calls. By morning, 3 separate tabloid outlets ran stories, painting Annie as a serial con artist who'd been targeting wealthy men across Seoul for years, citing anonymous sources and fabricated financial records. A fake interview surfaced, supposedly from a previous employer, describing a pattern of theft that had somehow never once resulted in a police report. Comment sections filled with strangers who'd never met her, dissecting her face, her accent, her right to even be in the country. Annie found out about all of it while making Sori breakfast, scrolling through her phone with hands that had started shaking somewhere around the 4th article. "This isn't real," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "None of this is real. Real doesn't matter once it's online." If you've ever had strangers decide who you are based on a lie, comment, "I've been there," because Annie's about to learn just how far someone will go to bury the truth. Kane's legal team moved fast, faster than Derek had accounted for. Cease and desist letters went out within hours. 2 outlets retracted their stories by noon, terrified of what a lawsuit from Kane's firm might cost them. The fabricated employer turned out not to exist at all, and one enterprising junior lawyer on Kane's team traced the entire smear campaign back to a single IP address registered to Derek Choi Sung's holding company. By that evening, every article was gone, scrubbed, buried. Derek watched his campaign collapse from his penthouse window, glass shaking slightly in his hand, and felt something ugly curdle in his chest. "If I can't destroy him," he muttered, "I'll destroy what he loves." Here's where it gets crazy, because Derek isn't the kind of man who loses gracefully, and what he does next is going to break your heart. Stay with me. 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. Kane, against every instinct he had, kept his distance, stationed men discreetly near Annie's building, made sure her legal troubles from the restaurant incident quietly disappeared, but didn't show up at her door again. He told himself it was respect for her wishes. In truth, he was terrified that if he pushed, she'd vanish from his life a second time, and he wasn't sure he'd survive watching that happen twice. On the 3rd day, everything fell apart. Annie came home from her shift to find the apartment silent in a way that made every hair on her arms stand up. Sori's shoes weren't by the door. The television wasn't playing the cartoons Sori insisted on every afternoon. The babysitter, a college student from 2 floors down who watched Sori on short shifts, was gone too, her phone going straight to voicemail. "Sori," Annie's voice cracked through the empty apartment. "Sori, baby, where are you?" Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "She's safe, for now. If you want her to stay that way, tell no one, especially not your Mafia friend. One night with me, alone, and you'll have her back by morning. Tell anyone, and you'll never see her again." Annie's knees gave out. She sat down hard on the kitchen floor, phone clutched to her chest, and for the first time since the divorce 3 years ago, she let herself cry, the kind of crying that came from somewhere too deep to control. If you're a parent watching this, comment below, because what Annie does next is the hardest decision any of us could ever imagine making. If you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe now, because this next part is going to gut you. She thought about calling Kane. Her thumb hovered over his contact for nearly a full minute, the weight of the threat pressing down on her chest like a stone. Tell anyone, and you'll never see her again. She couldn't risk it, not with Sori's life, not after already losing Hana, after promising a dying woman she'd protect her daughter no matter what it cost. So Annie did the only thing she could think of. She wrote a letter, short, desperate, addressed to no one and everyone, folded it under a picture frame on the kitchen counter, and walked out into the night alone, toward an address a stranger's voice had whispered through the phone, carrying nothing but her own fear and a promise she intended to keep, even if it destroyed her. She's about to walk into the most dangerous night of her life, completely alone, and Kane has no idea it's happening. If you want to see what happens when he finds out, make sure you're subscribed, because part 2 of this story is coming, and you will not want to miss it. Let's keep going. We're not done yet. The warehouse district on the city's edge was the kind of place that only existed in the gaps between everything else. Abandoned buildings, dead streetlights, the distant hum of a highway that felt like it belonged to another world entirely. Annie walked the last 3 blocks alone, her phone's flashlight the only thing cutting through the dark, her heartbeat so loud in her ears she almost missed the sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around. She already knew whose they were. You came, Derek's voice said, low and satisfied, somewhere behind her left shoulder. I wasn't sure you would. Where is she? Annie's voice came out steadier than she felt. Where's Sorry? Somewhere safe, for now. He circled around into her line of sight, hands in his pockets, smiling like this was a business transaction and not the destruction of a woman's entire life. One night, Annie, that's all I asked for. You give me that, and the girl goes home by morning. No harm done. You're insane. I'm patient, he corrected. Patient men get what they want eventually. I've just decided eventually is tonight. If you think Annie's about to get rescued in the next 30 seconds, you're wrong. Stay with me, because this is about to get so much worse before it gets better. Comment, I'm scared for her, if your stomach just dropped too. He gestured toward the warehouse door, and Annie, every instinct in her body screaming at her to run, forced her legs to carry her forward anyway. Because somewhere inside that building was a 5-year-old girl who trusted her to keep a promise, and Annie had never broken a promise in her life. Meanwhile, across the city, Kane sat in his office, staring at a phone that wouldn't stop ringing. It was his head of security. Sir, we lost visual on the apartment. Annie left 20 minutes ago, alone, no bag, no phone signal we can trace. And sir, the babysitter's phone just came back online. She says she was paid to leave. Someone took the little girl an hour before Annie's shift ended. Every ounce of blood in Kane's body turned to ice. Find her, he said, voice deadly quiet in a way that made the men in the room instinctively step back. Find her now, or I will burn this entire city down looking myself. Here's where it gets crazy, because Kane's about to do something no one in his organization has ever seen him do before. If you're not subscribed yet, now's the time, because the next 5 minutes of this story are absolutely unhinged. It took his tech team 11 minutes to trace the burner phone that had sent the ransom text to a cell tower on the industrial edge of the city. 11 minutes that felt, to Kane, like 11 years. He was in the car before the address was even fully confirmed, driving himself, no driver, no bodyguards trailing behind, because none of them could keep up with how fast he was moving. Inside the warehouse, Derek had grown impatient. Sit, he told Annie, gesturing to a chair positioned under a single hanging light, the rest of the space swallowed in shadow. We're going to have a nice, long night together. Where's Sorry? Annie demanded again, refusing to sit, refusing to let her voice shake, even though every part of her was screaming. You said she'd be here. She's fine, sleeping actually. Children are remarkably easy to sedate, lightly enough to keep them comfortable. He smiled at the flash of horror on Annie's face. Don't worry, she won't remember any of this by morning. If you're a parent, comment below, because I promise you, what happens in the next 60 seconds is going to make you want to reach through the screen. Don't go anywhere. Derek stepped closer, reaching for her, and Annie's survival instincts finally overrode everything else. She shoved him back hard enough that he stumbled into a stack of crates, and in the half-second of confusion that followed, she bolted for the door she'd come through. She didn't make it 3 steps before 2 of Derek's men blocked her path, grabbing her arms, dragging her back toward the chair, despite her screaming, despite her fighting with everything she had left in her. You done? Derek asked coldly, straightening his jacket, all pretense of charm gone now. Or should we make this harder than it needs to be? Annie stopped fighting, not because she'd given up, but because some cold, calculating part of her brain, the part that had survived 3 years alone in a foreign country, that had buried a best friend and raised her daughter on tip money and grit, took over completely. Fine, she said, forcing her voice level, forcing her body still. Fine, let go of my arms. Derek's men hesitated, glancing at their boss for confirmation. He nodded, almost amused, and they released her. Annie sat, slowly, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed somewhere past Derek's shoulder, like he wasn't even worth looking at directly. It was a small act of defiance, but it was hers. And in a night that had already stripped away almost everything else, she held onto it like a lifeline. You think this is control, she said quietly, sitting me in a chair, sedating a 5-year-old, making calls and burning money to punish a woman for slapping you after you grabbed her without permission. But you and I both know what this actually is. And what's that? Derek's voice had an edge now, the charm finally slipping. Fear, Annie said simply. You're terrified of a world where a woman says no, and it actually means something. That's all this ever was. His hand came up fast, and for one suspended second, Annie genuinely believed she was about to be struck. Braced for it, refused to flinch, refused to give him even that satisfaction. That was the exact moment the warehouse's side doors exploded inward. This is the moment you've been waiting for. If you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is the reason this story exists. Kane came through the wreckage like something unleashed. Not the composed businessman from the police station, not the careful, controlled man who ran boardrooms with a single raised eyebrow. This was the version of him that had built an empire out of nothing, the version his enemies whispered about in fear, the version Annie had never once seen directed at anyone but strangers. The two men holding Annie didn't even manage to reach for weapons before Kane was on them. It was fast, brutal, and over in seconds. One man down against a stack of crates, the other stumbling backward with a broken hand, screaming. Derek, to his credit, tried to run. He didn't get far. Kane caught him by the collar, slammed him against a support beam hard enough to rattle the whole structure, and for one terrifying second, Annie thought she was about to watch a man die in front of her. Kane, stop, she screamed. Sorry's still in here somewhere. I need you, please. Find her, please. Something in his name coming from her mouth, raw and desperate, cut through the red haze fast enough that Kane didn't finish whatever violence had been building in his hands. He dropped Derek to the concrete, delivered one final blow that left the man unconscious and bleeding, and turned instantly toward Annie. Where, he demanded. Where would he have kept her? They found Sori 4 minutes later in a locked side office, curled on a cot, drowsy but breathing, safe. Annie's legs finally gave out completely once she had the little girl in her arms, sobbing into her hair, rocking her gently while sirens began wailing somewhere in the distance. Kane's security team had already called the police the moment they'd located the warehouse. She's safe. He got there in time. But this story is FAR from over, because what Kane says next is going to change everything between them. Comment part 2, if you already know you're going to need it. It was nearly an hour later, after police had taken Derek into custody, after paramedics had checked Sori and confirmed she was unharmed, that Kane and Annie finally stood alone outside the warehouse, in the cold night air, the adrenaline finally starting to drain out of both of them. You should have called me, Kane said, his voice rough, equal parts fury and fear still audible underneath it. The second that message came through, you should have called me. He said if I told anyone, you should have trusted me. The words came out louder than he meant, echoing off the warehouse walls, and Annie's exhaustion finally cracked into something sharper. Trusted you. Her laugh was bitter, hollow. I trusted you once, Kane. I trusted you with everything, my whole life, my whole heart. And you believed strangers over your own wife, without ever once asking me for the truth. So forgive me, if trust isn't the first instinct I reach for when it comes to you. Kane opened his mouth to respond, and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he had absolutely nothing to say. And that's exactly where we're going to pause tonight, because what Kane discovers about his own second-in-command in part 2 is going to change everything you think you know about this story. If you want to see the truth finally come out, comment part 2 below right now, hit subscribe, and I promise you, this is only the beginning. The next morning, Kane didn't go home. He went straight to headquarters, locked himself in his office, and spent 6 hours doing something he should have done 3 years earlier, tearing apart every piece of evidence that had ended his marriage. This time, with the full resources of his organization, instead of a grieving man too broken to think straight. The photo metadata was the first thing to fall apart. A forensic tech confirmed within an hour that the images supposedly showing Annie and Marcus together had been taken nearly 6 weeks apart, in 2 different locations, then digitally composited to appear as one moment. The hotel room in the background wasn't even the hotel Marcus had stayed in during his Seoul trip. It was a boutique property that had opened 8 months after the photos were supposedly taken. Then came the text messages. Kane's cybersecurity team, traced the burner number back through 3 shell purchases, each one designed to be a dead end for anyone who didn't have Kane's kind of resources. But Kane did. And at the very end of that trail sat a payment record, small, easily missed, buried in a personal expense account, authorizing the phone's purchase. Junho's account. If you've ever discovered the person closest to you was the one who betrayed you the whole time, comment, "I've been there," because Kane's about to have that exact moment, and it's about to get ugly. If you're enjoying this story, make sure you're subscribed, because part 2 needs your support to happen. The witness statement was the final nail. The hotel employee who'd sworn he saw Annie leaving Marcus's room at 2 in the morning turned out to be, on closer inspection of the payroll ledgers Kane had glossed over, 3 years earlier in his grief, a part-time actor who'd been paid in 3 installments, each one signed off by the same account. Kane sat back in his chair, the office silent except for his own breathing, and felt something in his chest go cold and still, in a way that felt almost peaceful. The rage he'd expected didn't come screaming in. Instead it settled, low and permanent, like a decision being made. He called Junho into his office at 4 that afternoon. Junho walked in with the same easy confidence he always carried. A decade of loyalty, a decade of trust, a decade of being the one man in the organization Kane never second-guessed. He sat down across from Kane's desk without being asked, the way he always did, and it was that small, familiar arrogance that made Kane's jaw tighten hardest. "You wanted to see me?" Kane slid the folder across the desk without a word. He watched Junho's face as he opened it, watched the practiced calm flicker, just barely, at the edges. A man less trained in reading faces might have missed it. Kane didn't miss anything. "I don't know what this is supposed to prove," Junho said finally, closing the folder with deliberate slowness. "It proves you spent 4 months building a case to destroy my marriage," Kane said, his voice quiet in the way that made grown men in his organization sweat. "It proves you paid a man to lie under oath. It proves you doctored photos of my wife to make me believe she'd betrayed me, because a married man who trusted his wife was harder for you to manipulate than a broken one who trusted no one. Here's where it gets crazy, because Junho isn't even going to try denying it. Stay with me, because his confession is about to make you furious. Comment traitor if you already hate this guy." Junho's composure finally cracked, and underneath it wasn't guilt. It was something closer to contempt. "You want to know why I did it?" His voice sharpened, 10 years of buried resentment finally surfacing. "Because loving her made you weak, Kane. You stopped making the hard calls. You started hesitating, second-guessing decisions that used to take you 30 seconds. This organization needed you sharp, and she was making you soft. I needed you alone, focused, the way you used to be. So you destroyed my life. I saved this organization." Kane stood slowly, buttoning his jacket, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something almost gentle, which was, everyone who knew him understood, the most dangerous register he possessed. "You're done," Kane said. "Not fired, done. You'll leave this city by the end of the week, and if I ever hear your name attached to my organization, my family, or anyone I care about again, the mercy I'm showing you right now will be the last mercy you ever receive from me. Do you understand?" Junho understood. He was gone from Seoul within 4 days, and Kane never spoke his name again. Derek's arrest made headlines by morning, though not the ones he'd spent years cultivating. Kidnapping, attempted assault, fabricating evidence to obstruct a police investigation. The same media outlets he'd once paid to smear Annie now covered his downfall with undisguised relish, the kind of gleeful reversal reserved for men who'd spent decades believing consequences were something that happened to other people. At the station, detectives read him his rights while he sat handcuffed to a metal table, jaw already swelling from where Kane had hit him, still muttering under his breath about lawyers and appeals and people who'd pay for this. "You think this ends with me?" Derek said, when one of the detectives finally sat across from him. "Kane's not clean either. Men like him never are. Dig deep enough, and you'll find worse than anything I did." The detective, unimpressed, simply slid a stack of paperwork across the table. "That's a conversation for another department. If it's true, right now, we've got you on video, abducting a 5-year-old. Focus on that." Whatever leverage Derek imagined he still held evaporated over the following weeks. His business partners, terrified of being associated with a kidnapping charge, severed ties within days. His father, a man who'd built the family's fortune on a reputation for ruthless respectability, disowned him publicly, rather than let the scandal touch the family name. By the time his trial date was set, Derek Choi Sung had gone from a man who dined at the city's most exclusive tables to a name whispered with disgust in the very circles that had once courted him. Annie was asked to testify. She almost said no. The thought of standing in a courtroom, reliving that warehouse, Sori's small, drowsy face on that cot, made her stomach turn. But she thought of Hana, of the promise she'd made to a dying woman, of every other person Derek had likely bullied into silence over the years, who never had a cane to kick down a door for them. She testified. Her voice didn't shake once. On the stand, the prosecutor asked her to walk the courtroom through that night. The phone call, the warehouse, the moment she believed she might not walk out of that building at all. Annie answered every question plainly, without embellishment, without theatrics, because she'd learned somewhere in the last 3 years that the truth didn't need decoration to be believed. It only needed someone willing to say it out loud. Derek's lawyer tried, briefly, to suggest she'd exaggerated her fear for sympathy. Annie looked him dead in the eye and said, "I have a 5-year-old at home who still sleeps with the hallway light on because of what your client did to her. Ask me again if you think I'm exaggerating." He didn't ask again. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict. The traitor's exposed. The truth is finally out. But Kane still has to face the woman he destroyed his own life to protect, and she's not going to make this easy on him. If you're enjoying the story, hit subscribe, because this next part is where things get emotional. Knowing the truth didn't fix anything, Kane understood that the moment he stood outside Annie's apartment door for the first time, the folder of evidence in his hand, and realized that proof of his own manipulation didn't erase 3 years of abandonment, humiliation, and grief he'd caused her. She let him in, mostly because Sori was napping, and she didn't want to argue in the hallway. She read the folder in silence, her face unreadable, and when she finally looked up at him, there were tears in her eyes that weren't relief. "So all of it," she said quietly. "The divorce, the way you looked at me like I was a stranger, the way you packed my things before I even knew what was happening, all of that was because of a man who wanted you sharper?" "Annie, I trusted you completely," she said, voice shaking now. "And instead of asking me, instead of giving me 30 seconds to explain, you just believed I was capable of destroying everything we built. That's what hurts, Kane. Not even Junho. You." He had no defense for that, because she was right, and he'd spent 3 years knowing she was right, and hoping he'd never have to say it out loud. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know it doesn't fix what I did. I know sorry doesn't buy back 3 years. But I need you to know I am sorry. Completely. Without excuse." Annie wiped her eyes, exhausted in a way that went bone deep. "I believe you're sorry. I don't know yet if that's enough." And that's exactly the question that's going to define the rest of this story. If you want to see whether Annie ever forgives him, comment part 2 below right now. Hit that subscribe button, and let's keep going. Because we are not done yet. He didn't push. He'd learned that much at least. He left the folder with her, told her to take whatever time she needed, and walked out of that apartment with no promises and no guarantees. Just the quiet, terrifying possibility that an apology, no matter how sincere, might not be enough to undo what he'd broken. Over the following weeks, Kane apologized in ways that had nothing to do with words. The first Tuesday, Annie came home to find the ancient, wheezing boiler in her building, the one the landlord had ignored for 2 winters running, completely replaced, no note, no explanation, just suddenly, blessedly, hot water. She knew immediately who was responsible. She threw away the thank you text she drafted 3 separate times. The second week, Sori's daycare called to say her tuition had been quietly covered for the semester by an anonymous family friend. Annie sat in her kitchen that night, furious and grateful in equal measure, and still didn't call him. The third week, he showed up at the restaurant where she worked, not inside, not making a scene, just standing across the street in the rain for 20 minutes, before walking away without a word. She watched him through the window the entire time, and told herself it didn't mean anything. By the 5th week, the small gestures had become something else entirely. Not bribes, not grand apologies, just the quiet, consistent presence of a man trying to prove, one Tuesday at a time, that he'd actually changed. He never pushed past a doorway she hadn't opened. He never once brought up the divorce, the flashback, the years she'd spent grieving a marriage he'd ended over a lie. He just kept showing up, kept absorbing her silence without flinching, kept leaving without asking for anything in return. Annie kept telling him no for 6 straight weeks, but somewhere around week 5, she noticed she'd stopped meaning it quite as much as she used to. On the 7th week, Kane stopped showing up. Annie noticed it before she wanted to admit she noticed it, the absence of his messages checking in, the boiler that had already been fixed with no new excuse to visit, the quiet that settled where his persistence used to be. She told herself it was relief. Some nights, staring at the ceiling with Sori asleep beside her, she almost believed it. Then a coworker mentioned, casually, that she'd seen Kane at a restaurant downtown with another woman. Annie told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that for exactly 4 days. If you think this story is about to give you a happy ending the easy way, you're wrong. Comment "Here we go" if you already know this next part is about to hurt. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe, because we're heading into the final stretch now. The woman's name was Una, a soft-spoken architect Kane's mother had been quietly introducing him to for months, ever since word had spread that his divorce was final, and his period of grief, as his mother called it, had gone on long enough. Kane hadn't pursued it. He'd simply stopped saying no, mostly out of exhaustion, mostly because 6 weeks of rejection from the only woman he actually wanted had worn down whatever fight he had left in him. He told himself it was fine. He told himself Annie had made her answer clear enough times that continuing to hope was its own kind of foolishness. He was 3 dates in, polite, quiet dinners that felt more like business meetings than romance, when Annie showed up at the restaurant. She hadn't planned it. She'd been walking Sori home from a friend's birthday party, 2 blocks over, when she caught sight of him through the restaurant's front window, sitting across from a woman in a soft green dress, both of them laughing at something Annie couldn't hear. Something in her chest cracked open in a way she wasn't prepared for. Here's where it gets crazy, because Annie's about to do something she never saw herself doing. If you're invested in this story, comment "Let's go" right now, because this next scene is the moment everything changes. She told Sori's babysitter, waiting outside, to take her home. Then she smoothed down her coat, pushed open the restaurant door, and walked straight toward their table like she belonged there. Conversation around them didn't stop, exactly, but it dimmed, the way rooms do when something is about to happen. Kane looked up first, and whatever composure he'd built over 3 months of careful distance evaporated the instant he saw her face. "Annie, I'm sorry to interrupt," Annie said, and her voice, despite everything churning underneath it, came out smooth, almost pleasant, aimed directly at the woman across the table. "You've had enough time with my man." Una blinked, startled, glancing between them with quiet confusion. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." "It's fine," Annie said, not unkindly. "It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. But I did, and I'm here to fix it, if he'll let me." The entire restaurant had gone silent by now, forks paused mid-air, every eye in the room fixed on the scene unfolding at table 12. Kane stood slowly, something between disbelief and desperate hope written across his face, in a way Annie had never once seen him wear in public. "If you didn't just gasp out loud, I don't believe you." Comment she came back below, because this is the moment 3 years of pain finally starts turning into something else. Subscribe now if you haven't already. You do not want to miss what happens next. "Annie," Kane said again, quieter this time, like her name was something fragile. "I've spent 6 weeks telling you no," she said, and her voice finally cracked, all the careful composure slipping. "Not because I didn't believe you were sorry. Because I was terrified that if I said yes, and you hurt me again, I wouldn't survive it a second time. I would never." "I know you believe that," she cut in gently. "But belief isn't the same as certainty. I needed 6 weeks to decide if I was brave enough to trust you again anyway. Watching you walk into someone else's life just now, it turns out that was exactly what I needed to see, because I realized I'd rather risk being hurt by you than spend one more day pretending I didn't still love you." Una, with the quiet grace of someone who understood exactly what she'd walked into, rose from the table, offered Annie a small, understanding smile, and slipped out of the restaurant without another word. Kane crossed the space between them in 3 steps. "I still haven't forgiven you," Annie said quickly, before he could speak, before he could hope for more than what she was actually offering. "Not fully, not yet. 3 years doesn't disappear because of one dinner scene. But if you're willing to be patient with me the way I was never patient enough to be with myself, I'd like to start over. Slowly, honestly, no lies between us, no matter how ugly the truth is. If your heart just did something funny, comment crying below, because I promise you, you're not alone. We are almost at the end of tonight's story, so stay with me." Kane didn't answer with words. He reached for her hand instead, carefully, like he expected her to pull away, like 3 years of grief had taught him that nothing good was ever guaranteed to stay. Annie hesitated. The restaurant held its breath. Then, slowly, she laced her fingers through his. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't fireworks or a grand romantic score swelling in the background. It was quieter than that. 2 people who had broken each other, choosing, deliberately, imperfectly, to try again anyway. Somewhere near the restaurant entrance, Sori, who had refused to go home with the babysitter and trailed in just in time to see it, grinned so wide her whole face lit up, small and delighted at a moment she didn't fully understand, but somehow knew mattered. "Does this mean we're a family now?" Sori asked, loud enough that half the restaurant laughed softly, despite themselves. Annie looked at Kane, Kane looked at Sori, and for the first time in 3 years, something in his chest that had been clenched shut finally, quietly, began to loosen. "Not yet," Annie said gently, crouching down to Sori's level, still holding Kane's hand. "But maybe someday, one step at a time, okay?" Sori nodded seriously, satisfied with that answer in the effortless way only children can be. Kane's mother heard about the restaurant scene before he'd even made it home that night. Seoul's wealthy circles moved information faster than any news outlet, and a scene like that one didn't stay contained to a single dining room. She called him at 11, her voice clipped in the particular way that meant she was choosing her words with great care. "You humiliated Yuna in front of half the city," she said. "I didn't plan any of it. That's rarely an excuse that matters, in my experience." A pause, long enough that Kane braced himself for whatever came next. "Is this the same woman? The one from before?" "Yes." Another pause. When his mother spoke again, some of the sharpness had drained out of her voice, replaced by something more tired, more human. "I watched you after that divorce, Kane. 3 years of watching my son become someone I barely recognized, sharper, colder, better at business, and worse at everything that actually mattered. I didn't understand it at the time. I do now. Mother, I'm not finished," her voice steadied. "I want to meet her properly, not at some chance encounter in a restaurant. A real dinner, where I can look this woman in the eye and decide for myself whether she deserves a second chance with my son, because clearly you've already decided, and clearly my opinion arrived several years too late to change your mind on the first attempt. It wasn't approval, not exactly. But it was a door left open, and after everything, Kane understood better than most what it meant to be handed a door instead of a wall. Annie agreed to the dinner 3 weeks later, arriving in a plain navy dress instead of anything meant to impress. Sori's small hand tucked in hers the entire walk to the restaurant. Kane's mother studied her for a long moment before saying anything at all. "My son tells me you slapped a man across the face for touching you without permission," she finally said. "I did." "Good." The older woman's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I always thought the women in this family were too polite for their own good. Sit down. Tell me about yourself. Not the version my son's lawyers investigated 3 years ago. The real one." By the end of that dinner, something had shifted that even Kane hadn't expected. Not full acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of it. The same slow, deliberate rebuilding that seemed to define every relationship he was trying to repair. And that's where tonight's story ends. But this is far from over. There's still so much left unanswered, whether Junho really disappears for good or comes back for revenge, whether Kane and Annie's slow rebuild survives its first real test, and what happens the day Sori is finally old enough to ask why her family looks the way it does. This story has a part 2, and I am not making it without you. If you want to see what happens next, comment part 2 right now. I read every single one of them. If you made it this far, that means you were hooked. So do me a favor and hit that subscribe button before you go, because I've got so many more stories like this one coming. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.